Started. So welcome everybody to the Science and Data Subcommittee meeting for October 13th. On the agenda today, after we review the minutes, we have a couple of draft documents that were sent around. I'm sorry, I'm going in the wrong order again, like I did last week. First on the agenda is to discuss the carbon budget draft report and any updates from the carbon budget task group. Then going to draft sections from the CAP that on the social cost of carbon and cost of carbon review that we did, and also the greenhouse gas inventory review. I sent the former out on Monday, I believe. Maybe it was Tuesday morning, and Jared just sent out the latter this afternoon, but we can put those up on the screen to review. Then go to the monitoring and assessment task group update, to the extent there is an update. Talk about, kind of circle back on our discussion from last time on proportional reductions in emissions and statutory clarity there, and then cover a couple of miscellaneous items before public comment. Is there any changes to the agenda or additions?
I just specifically note in the miscellaneous, apologies that this was not clear enough when the agenda was being initially crafted, but there was a conversation that happened at the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee last week on this question of, one of the draft recommendations coming from the transportation task group relates to Vermont potentially joining the Transportation and Climate Initiative program. It's a little bit complicated to figure out both projecting and then accounting for associated emissions reductions with relation to that program, because it's a regional program. And of course, our accounting happens in an in-boundary statewide level. So they requested that we spend a little bit of time as a subcommittee on this question of how to assess the emissions reduction potential of Vermont's participation in TCI, given that it's kind of a unique action as a regional action. Would suggest that specifically for an opening discussion, no proposal to discuss, but just want to talk it through during that miscellaneous section of the agenda. And I've got some background I can share on my screen if that's helpful, as maybe others do as well.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jared. All right. Well, let's go into it. Let's start with the carbon budget draft report that was sent around a couple of different times, and I guess Jared, are you able to give a little context as to where, or maybe Jane, as to where things are with that carbon budget report, and then we can go into thoughts people might have had in reviewing it.
Yeah, I was just hopping over from a frantic meeting trying to plan the agenda for the council meeting next Tuesday, and one of the main components of the council meeting next Tuesday is supposed to be the carbon budget and carbon budget recommendations. And I haven't received or digested what that is going to look like from Ag and Eco yet. And so I'm questioning whether or not it'll happen at this point. But regardless, the timeline was supposed to be that next Tuesday's council meeting would take up the carbon budget and any recommendations that were coming from the carbon budget, which really probably largely spoke to the work that was presented to the council on Tuesday around the RFI, because that was very intertwined, it felt like. And then the only other future recommendations, I suspect, will be to continue to invest in research in that space around the idea of exploring a contract with Harvard Forest to look at the forecasting. So future scenarios of carbon sequestration and based on land use patterns and changes. So I don't expect there to be anything else, but we haven't sent the carbon budget to the full council yet for review. So.
Okay, and the RFI discussions, do you mind expanding on that? I wasn't able to be at the council meeting yesterday, and where that landed, and just, I mean, we had, I think, recommended or just, I don't know if it came as the form of a recommendation, but we had gone over, potentially splitting the RFI into two in this subcommittee, and where did that land with the council?
Took action on moving forward with two separate RFIs yesterday. One for life cycle analysis, and then the one in the agricultural space may actually be more mature for an RFP and not need an RFI, in that we know what the questions are there, and if we decided to act, we could move forward with the work as an RFP and not need to ask any more questions about in that space, because the carbon budget sort of informs that RFP. I'm not sure where that really goes, to be honest, yet. Like, we haven't reflected on it internally in A&R. I'm not sure who's taking the lead on that, if it's ag agency, A&R. I think there's a lot to sort out still. But Julie, you came off mute, maybe you have something to add there.
We don't have resources for that right now, right? Like, and I worry at times we get the cart a little bit in front of the horse. I think it's a recommendation. Hearing the counselors yesterday, some of whom expressed concerns about timeliness and having it ready for this initial action plan, like that's not realistic. And so some of it is just, I think it's a recommendation that we believe that additional evaluation and analysis could be valuable in this space, but at some point we're going to have to weigh that against all of the other sort of recommendations we're bringing forward. And it wasn't clear to me that we reached agreement on kind of next steps. I think, Jane, you're right in flagging that certainly there was a strong sense that an RFI is unnecessary. We could move directly to an RFP. But then no discussion of whether that's a recommendation that goes in the climate action plan as something the legislature would need to fund, how that ranks in terms of priority, like what if it should be brought up as priorities. And it may be that we need a sort of a catch-all place. I probably should have raised this morning in the CAP drafting working group, but maybe we need a catch-all place for further study and analysis. And can identify some of these pieces, because this isn't going to be the only one where I think we would benefit from additional technical consultant support.
Just quickly, and then Jared, you and Megan can clarify. We did talk about that this morning a bit, because that is, I mean, we're committed to doing an RFI for life cycle analysis, a supplemental life cycle analysis, but that doesn't cost us anything, and it's the same thing. It'll move to an RFP, and then there's also the municipal vulnerability, and there's a lot coming out with additional economic modeling that we still need to support and advance. And so, yeah, thinking about how it all reviews and ranks, and some of it we have spec'd out with the remaining technical analysis funds for this year's budget, but we do not have enough funding to do it all.
And I think just sort of having a holding place for those, and perhaps that was in the first half hour of the meeting I missed this morning, but having a holding place for those will be increasingly important. I think there are probably others that will get raised as we kind of continue to move through honing the actions and strategies in the climate plan.
Megan, I think you had your hand up first.
I didn't, but
Oh, all right. Well then, Jared.
Jared's permission, my comment is very brief.
Go ahead.
I just wanted, and I think Julie, you were kind of wading into this, but the way I interpret the Global Warming Solutions Act, the Climate Council does not have the authority to direct ANR, to spend funds in a specific way at this point in time. They do through the Climate Action Plan, obviously, and one of their charges in the Global Warming Solutions Act is to identify the means to accurately measure the state's greenhouse gas emissions. So it's squarely within the role of the council. It's just that there's at this point in time, they can't tell us to spend money on that, especially money that we don't necessarily have. So I just wanted to point that out, that would be my recommendation on how the council should move forward in terms of it being incorporated into the climate action plan.
Thanks, Megan. Sorry, Jared. Go ahead.
That's good. I want to go ahead and share my screen because I have not yet reviewed the entire. Can folks see this document? This is the budget draft.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. I haven't yet reviewed the entire document, but certainly the first part of it. And one of the things that really stands out to me is this section in terms of what data is actually available, where are there gaps, and as Colin and Ali Kasiba have both brought up in the past, the implications for needing baseline data, and that existing data sets are either for a single period or have uncertainty or errors too great for stakeholders to consider legitimate. There are so many really important questions about data availability, data fidelity, kind of accuracy, trust when it comes to a lot of the agriculture, forestry, and other land use kind of emissions estimates with regard to the carbon budget, especially on both on the sources and sinks side. And I just really appreciated how forthcoming and transparent the authors were about those data challenges. And I think that really, to me, that really suggests that an RFP is necessary, so we figure out what our options are for trying to address some of those data gaps and data quality issues. Some may not be resolvable, and all we can do is try to improve them on a going forward basis. But that was one of the key takeaways for me that really stood out. I did not have a sufficient appreciation for those issues before reading this report. So that was, I mean, it points to more work being needed, but at least it was helpful in terms of where things stand. And it also relates to me, I agree with Julie that I wish we had had more time yesterday to discuss the next steps with regard to an RFP and the different roles, because, I think that, it's been clear from the outset that our subcommittee, through our GHG task group, but our subcommittee as a whole has had primary responsibility for the task of reviewing the greenhouse gas inventory and any kind of supplemental accounting recommendations. And it's been clear that there's been a task group at the same time from Ag and Ecosystems that has been focused on the carbon budget. My, thinking on this, which I believe tracks with everybody else on this subcommittee, given our previous conversations, is that, the inventory has always been done, and the law references the inventory as tracking and assessing our gross emissions, our sources of emissions. And that the purpose of the carbon budget as a standalone task was to have better data, a better sense of what some of the sinks are, and being able to look at the ag, forestry, and other land use sectors. And I guess, when I think about the recommendations that came from the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee and that kind of ended up in our revised set of recommendations, I really think they fall into two buckets. One is, what can we do to improve the accuracy and flexibility in terms of appropriateness for a Vermont environment of the tools we use to track gross emissions from the agricultural sector? And then at the same time, how can we address all of those data gap and data quality issues that have been surfaced in the carbon budget report? And, I think, part of the challenge we faced in just communication and understanding each other between science and data and the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee is that, you know, those two separate task groups were focused on related tasks, but there wasn't any overlap between who was on them. And I do think that hopefully one of the lessons learned is that if we go forward with an RFP that is aimed at having, looking at what our options are for both the carbon budget and for the inventory, I think it's imperative that we have involvement from folks in both of those subcommittees and not just say, oh, one is over here and one is over there, because of the interrelation between those issues, and to avoid some of what has kind of what had happened earlier with kind of misunderstandings, I think, between the different roles of the different committees and who was doing what. So that's just my broad reflection. I don't know, I'd be curious if others have takeaways from reading that carbon budget report, but I really think that if there are going to be any recommendations with regard to changes in the inventory, of course, the ultimate authority there is Secretary Moore and ANR and DEC. But I think that any recommendations and any discussions related to that should happen through the subcommittee that has been focused on it, which has been us, not exclusively, but certainly, I do not think it would be appropriate if there are going to be recommendations that come out of that RFP that relate to the inventory to only be discussed by the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee.
Yeah, I'd like to second that. That is a real concern, in that it not only has to make sense, I think, for agriculture, it has to make sense for sort of our going operation and maintenance of the inventory. Not dissimilar to the conversations we've had around the life cycle accounting, right? Like there's sort of the intent, which may be spot on, and then there's the practical reality of how we do it, and we need to make sure that both of those pieces sort of stay stuck together as we advance these conversations. And I agree, Jared. I think the Science and Data Subcommittee has that charge. Would welcome participation, input, good thinking from the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, but at the end of the day, ANR needs to be able to operationalize whatever those recommendations are, and that has to be given fair weight.
Richard, go ahead.
Hi. I really enjoyed reading that carbon budget document, because it's pretty clearly written, and it's in a domain that I am only slightly familiar with. And so it taught me a lot about agriculture and forestry and how to do these analyses. So I just as a reader, I enjoyed the opportunity to learn something about that domain. There's one specific area where the inventory and the budget overlap, and that's the area of burning wood for heat. The recommendation from the IPCC, which is reflected in the recommendations from the US EPA and is reflected in Colin's practice in the inventory, is to not count CO2 emissions from burning wood for heat on grounds that they are addressed elsewhere in the land use part of the comprehensive assessment. So, and in fact, the carbon budget document does have a line in table 13 that is labeled decay and combustion, and it has a value associated with it. But that value can't be used as a placeholder for the emissions of carbon dioxide from burning alone, because it's for decay and combustion, and the value is larger than what it takes to heat all the houses in Vermont. So it's clearly not the right value for burning, for the amount of wood that is burned. Colin has a methodology for estimating how much wood is burned, because he uses that estimate to estimate the emissions of other greenhouse gases, N2O and methane from burning firewood. So we have an estimate from the inventory of how much wood is burned for heat. I would love it if the people developing the carbon budget could refine their analysis well enough to be able to say, so by how much does the forest cover in Vermont decrease each year as a result of wood removed for burning for heat? And you would hope that that number would match up with the number that Colin estimates from an entirely different method. And we don't want to count them both. We want one or the other, but we can't have neither. We have to have one or the other. And currently, I can't get the firewood number, the wood number out of the carbon inventory. So it either needs refinement, or we need to decide to use the estimates that Colin has already made and then estimate the CO2 releases from those. And I have separately proposed a way to estimate this, the global warming potential of carbon dioxide from burning wood is less than what it is from other carbon dioxide releases. It's probably about roughly half, a third to a half, because of the regrowth over a period of many years to replace the stuff that's burned. So that's one specific area of overlap. We either need the budget fixed, or we need to go with Colin's number.
Thanks, Richard. I have a follow-up, but I'll let Lou go first.
Yeah, just to second Richard's comments here that accounting for wood burning, the carbon emissions associated with wood burning, we do need to make sure we take account for them. And one way we might consider to do that is by looking at different time horizons. Certainly in the long term, we'd expect that the carbon would be resequestered, but in the shorter term, which is what we're primarily concerned with at the present, that may not be the case. And so this accounting, I think, is an important part of our work.
Megan?
This is actually Colin. I'm sitting in the Catamount with Megan. I just wanted to touch on Richard's point. Richard, you said I had those values for methane and nitrous oxide, and that is true. But that is also the value that I kind of list in the back of the report. So it's not technically part of the gross, but that's the biogenic kind of component, the carbon dioxide component that's in the back of the report in that method as well. And that could be expanded to kind of other sectors, which has not been done yet, but that includes estimates of wood use in the residential, commercial, and industrial sectors. And sorry, just one other thing. I do certainly appreciate that time horizon question. And Richard, I think your GWP bio kind of or idea is definitely an interesting one. And I don't know what the final decision will be. I don't think it's mine, but I think it would be interesting to at least kind of include that as even an in-between. So call it 0, call it with the GWP bio, which I think if I recall was like 0.3, and included as kind of entirely emitted, which is how I have it now, something like that. But yeah, just want to appreciate the looking into that you've done. Thanks for that.
So I kind of want to tease out, it seems like we have a question that we need to answer, and Richard, you brought it up, and to be fair, you've been bringing this up for all summer and even before the summer, right? Is that, and correct me where I don't understand something here, but we have the inventory, which there's a value that's kind of in the appendix to the report or in the back of the report calculating biogenic emissions. And we have the carbon budget, and one of those places really needs to count the carbon emissions from wood. It seems to me that this is most timely in how our mitigation options might be evaluated. Again, I'm not saying anything that Richard hasn't said before, but that we really, if we're proposing a district heating measure or advanced wood heat or what have you, we really need to be understanding the real impact of that. And so I guess I have a question is it really just in evaluating the mitigation options in the short term, and then we need to fix it in one of the carbon budget or the inventory, or is it all of that needs to be done ASAP?
Well, I don't know about ASAP. The part that I am really fixated on is evaluating various strategies for reducing CO2 emissions from heating buildings. This is not about wood for pulp. It's not about wood for furniture, wood for construction. This is about wood that is cut to be burned for heat. Now, that's my focus. And I've tried to be consistent about that. So if you have alternate strategies for how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from heating buildings, and one or more of those strategies includes using wood, then it needs to be accounted for. I'd like to see it be in the inventory as well, but for sure it has to be in comparing various strategies to each other.
Oops. No, stupid.
So let me just ask, is there broad agreement with that statement that Richard just put forth, that we really need to do this for evaluating options, at least in the buildings sector? And then secondly, that this should be accounted for in the inventory? Or is there?
My understanding, and would appreciate Colin or others who are actually knowledgeable weighing in and correcting me if I get this wrong, is that this is not a particularly significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. And just am concerned about sort of the appreciating the interest. I think at some point we also need to just be realistic about the level of detail we're able to bring to some of these conversations. And I'm not sure we have like I guess, for lack of a better word, I'm not sure it's a value added proposition to spend our time and energy here. That said, Colin or Brian, I see you're both on the line, or Megan, if I am undervaluing the emissions from wood heat in Vermont, please jump in and say the word, compared to other sources of building related emissions.
May I add something, Secretary Moore, just before they answer? My concern is not about the current use, it's about proposing to have vastly expanded use in the future.
Okay, that's helpful clarification, Richard. Thank you. Looks like Colin has his hand up. Maybe he can correct my record here.
Colin, you're on mute if you're trying to talk.
Sorry, everybody, audio difficulties. I think that, and I'd have to go back to the inventory, honestly, to check the numbers, but the carbon dioxide emissions from wood combustion, kind of, if counted in full at the point of combustion, are actually fairly significant. But what I think is a little bit difficult, and Richard kind of touched on this, and that's kind of gotten at, and I guess Lou as well, is that the reason that those are not counted in the greenhouse gas inventory and kind of using methodologies like that is because they are assumed to be resequestered. And so it does very much get at that timescale question. And I think that's what Richard is getting at his GWP bio idea, in that, well, okay, we'll count it, we'll partially count it because we acknowledge that some of it will be resequestered, but the time scale really matters, and it matters, kind of depends on what our goals are too, and what reduction levels we're trying to hit by when. So I agree with you, Julie, except I think a lot of that we've kind of we've kind of gotten that in a way in the inventory. And so I don't know exactly, I'm not clear exactly what the kind of suggestion is, if it's to include that in the actual inventory kind of gross totals, or just kind of expand that analysis or check it against the carbon budget. I'm not entirely clear on that. And I apologize, I'm going to have to drop off in just a second here, but I do appreciate this conversation.
Lou.
Yeah, to Richard's point, thinking about future use, and Jared probably knows has a better sense of the scale than I do. But thinking towards the future of heating in Vermont, that a large portion of heating could come from cold climate heat pumps, or it could come from wood heating, any combination in between, and not including other sources of heat. So I think there are varying ways that wood heat could be used, and to not have a complete set of data on the carbon impacts of that use, I think wouldn't make sense. So my intuition is to actually flesh this out as part of the greenhouse gas inventory.
Okay. Richard, is your hand back up, or is that an old one?
It's new, actually.
Okay, good.
Some of you know that I have a family connection here. My son Asa was intimately involved in developing the 2016 Comprehensive Energy Plan for Vermont, and worked with several of you on that. I love Asa dearly, but I think that there's a mistake in the approach in that document. And that document solves the problem of building heat in the out years, in the later years, by assuming greatly expanded use of wood for heat. And maybe the new comprehensive energy plan won't do that. But I'm concerned that if we say we're going to plug the greenhouse gas emission problem, if we're going to plug a hole with burning zero carbon firewood, that's not the way we should be going.
And I'm happy to speak to kind of the way that EAN did our modeling in terms of emissions reduction pathways in the thermal sector. And there was a lot of kind of what are known, proven, available measures, and what is a very kind of realistic look at what is possible in terms of our overall heat load as a state in the residential and commercial sectors in particular, and what can be switched away from fossil fuels. And we basically took the approach of modeling as much of an expansion as possible with very efficient cold climate heat pumps of different varieties, whether that's air to air, air to water, ducted, ductless, different configurations based on different scenarios. At the same time, we have very old housing stock and a lot of old inefficient buildings, including large buildings that are difficult to heat, oftentimes that are laid out in a way with multiple rooms that are difficult for a system to reliably work in, given existing technologies. Of course, I think there is hope that more and more of our heat load can be met through efficient heat pumps, given the low carbon electricity supply that would power them. At the same time, I think if you talk to kind of anybody who is really familiar with the building space in Vermont, there are both for kind of reliability reasons and for kind of just the reasons of our cold climate and our building layouts. It is often very beneficial, and folks are advised and wise to rely not just on one heating source. And in the event that heat pumps cannot or should not be relied on to meet the entire home or building heating load, and a combustion source of heat as a backup is necessary, then I think those sources need to be compared against each other. And I agree, Richard. I think that part of this RFI that we want to do on assessing life cycle emissions should assess more carefully the life cycle emissions related to both wood heating and wood for electricity generation, which have very different profiles and different efficiencies. But I just want to, there was a study that Signal Labs did a few years ago, and they looked at wood heating in the northern forest region. And what they found is that even if you use a life cycle assessment for wood pellets produced in the Northeast, you get both upfront and over the lifetime of 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions using wood as opposed to fossil fuels. And I also think that it's not entirely, I don't think that we necessarily should assume that an expansion of the number of households or buildings that have wood heat as a backup or supplemental system means an expansion of wood heating in Vermont. And here's why, because it matters how much wood is actually used and how efficiently it is burned. The vast majority of wood heating in Vermont is done with very old, very inefficient, very polluting wood stoves, many of which were built before 1988, before the EPA had regulations on this. And so it is possible, and this is the analysis that the Clean Energy Development Fund has done, that we can expand the number of folks who have wood heat as a primary or a backup source. If those folks are using efficient, modern, advanced either boilers or stoves, we can reduce the emissions, both greenhouse gas and particulate emissions, if at the same time we're really working to change out some of those older, much more inefficient wood burning appliances, especially old stoves. So I just, that's not an answer around any of this. I hope it provides some more context and nuance. I agree that as we go forward, we should have an appreciation for the complexity of the life cycles around these questions, but I also think we need to have a realistic perspective, given our climate, given our building stock, that oftentimes it is necessary or advisable to have a combustion source of heat as a backup or as a supplement. And in that case, wood is almost always better, especially in modern, efficient wood heating equipment than a fossil alternative. And I think that if we do the life cycle approach you're talking about, Richard, that will be borne out again, as it has been in previous studies. So why not do it? But I'm just saying, I don't think we should expect that, any study is going to say burning wood is in an efficient pellet stove or a modern wood boiler is going to be, worse than fossil fuels across the board. All the studies show significant reduction compared to fossil fuels.
That's a straw man. I was not claiming that. What I am claiming
I'm not saying
is,
you were.
okay, thank you. I was going to say, the friend hath spoken my mind, but until you would tell that very last comment of yours. I was, before you gave your excellent analysis, Jared, I was going to say much the same thing, which is that I think it's quite likely that if you promote using wood for heat as a backup for electric, cold climate electric heat pumps, and that results in you installing a whole lot more electric heat pumps, then that's probably a net benefit. But we won't know unless we do the analysis.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, well, I'll comment in a minute. Lou, why don't you go, and then I'll say something, but we got to get to a path forward on this as well. So go ahead, Lou.
Yeah, just quickly. I agree with Jared's comments that all makes sense. I think there's certainly a future for wood heating in Vermont. That's as apparent. I would just say that there are if we're thinking that the magnitude is about half that of fossil fuels, there is a real non-trivial emissions component when the wood is actually burned. And I guess from a pure analytical standpoint, we might actually consider this not as a life cycle analysis, but rather as two separate pieces, one in the budget, one in the inventory, where there are emissions similar to the fossil fuel sector at the time of burning, and that there's sequestration later on in growing forest. These, I think, could be considered as two different reactions instead of, as a life cycle analysis, as we've kind of, kicked around in other places. But these are two separate processes that need to be fully documented such that we understand what the impact is when wood heating expands its foothold in Vermont.
Thanks, Lou. And so, so the question is that do we, the question in my mind is still, right now we're counting it as 0 in the inventory and in our analysis of new mitigation options. That wood stove looks particularly, well, I won't comment on its efficiency. My point is though that right now we have a 0 value when we're evaluating our mitigation options, and I haven't heard anything that everybody thinks that is right, but we are choosing to give it a value in our evaluation right now, and that I tend to agree with Richard's point. I think that you're making that, hey, if this has some value, we may, some emissions value, either life cycle or immediate, we may be shortchanging our progress to our targets. Say we may think we're making it, but really we need to do more elsewhere because we haven't gotten the emissions reductions that we've modeled. And so so that leads me to the question is that, do we need to recommend a value? By doing nothing, we would essentially be recommending 0 be the value. And so I think regardless of what we do, we're recommending a value. So if we don't do anything, we've recommended stay at 0. Or do we get on a path to actually recommend a value here to be used in the modeling and to understand? And I know it's getting kind of late in the game here, but I think we could still do that and trying to just get us to kind of next steps, whether it's the task group kind of looks into this and provides a recommendation for next week or what have you. So Jared, go ahead.
I just want to say I really appreciated the distinction that Lou was making in terms of, how this shows up in the inventory versus how this shows up in a carbon budget versus how this shows up in a life cycle accounting, because I think those are all different questions. And I would be really curious to hear from, Ali Kasiba at A&R, and who worked on the forest section of the carbon budget, her advice on this question. It's not immediately clear to me that a different value is appropriate for the inventory at this point in time. I do think that question is closely related to the findings of the carbon budget. And I do think that we should have that both wood heating and wood for electricity generation should be assessed in the supplemental life cycle accounting. But it's not immediately clear to me what the basis would be or for a different number, or what that number would be for the inventory at this point in time. I'd be really curious to hear what Ali has to say about that, among others.
I just want to add, it's one, there's for the inventory, and then there's, I guess it is inextricably intertwined of for the analysis that we're doing on our mitigation options. I think that'll come up a little bit later when we talk about the miscellaneous item that you talked about, Jared, at the start here. It's kind of the same sort of question. Richard,
and if I could just,
go ahead.
Sorry, if it's okay, Richard, I just briefly want to add one piece of context that I think is really important here. which is what we assume would happen. These are rough numbers. I think it's something like 75% of Vermont is forested, and something like 75 to 80% of those forest lands are privately owned. And when I've seen in the past, from when I worked at the Agency of Commerce and on the Working Lands Enterprise Board, we saw surveys of forest land owners in Vermont and across the northern forest. And there are some folks who own forest land who are, their primary motivation for doing that is habitat, recreation. They have enough money that they do not depend on harvests on any level to keep that land as forest. What we have seen in, over the last decade plus is that there are a number, the pressures on fragmentation and on private forest land owners is that in order to practice responsible forestry, there were markets that previously existed for low-grade wood in the pulp and paper markets in Maine and New York that have closed down. And one of the things that we heard from at least half of those private forest landowners in Vermont is unless there are markets for them to sell their wood into when they do periodic sustainable harvests in compliance with the use value appraisal program, the current use program, that helps them keep forests as forests. And so I do think that there's this bigger picture question of, if we don't have markets for folks to sell, including firewood and pellet wood into, to what extent are we actually creating pressure on landowners to have a different use for that land other than forests for all of the cultural, economic, working lands, carbon sequestration values? I don't think it's as simple as saying, if we don't do wood heat, we avoid these emissions, because it's bound up in a larger forest economy that without markets for that wood to periodically go into, it makes it more difficult to keep that land forested, including as a sink. So I just think that this is really complex, and we need to also be aware of that. I'm not saying that suggests a certain value or a certain way of quantifying this in the inventory, but I think we need to have very much front and center the experience of forest stewards and landowners in Vermont and what enables them to keep their land as forest versus what would put pressure on them to convert that land to a different use.
Sorry, thanks for that context, Jared. I think there's all kinds of implications for the policy actions that might come through, and how it's kind of, I want to narrow the scope a little bit though of this group, because I think you could say weatherization has economic impacts, and then that drives other, emissions impacts, because people drive more to recreate more or something. That's like a little further afield than where you were going. And I think your example had a more direct link, but I think our conversation, we really need to tie it to a path forward too at this point in the meeting of are we, how are we going forward here and in resolving this issue? Richard, go ahead.
This question is similar to some of the other questions that have been raised that we punted to an RFI. Okay, and I think the proposed language for the RFI should in fact cover further investigation of this question, in particular to get expert opinion on what the number for the GWP bio ought to be for Vermont forest, whether it be 0.3 or 0.5 or 0.7, what that number ought to be if you're going to do that. My immediate concern is to be sure that when we do analyses of alternative strategies for wood heat, that we account for the short-lasting carbon in the air that is released by burning wood. I don't think Colin needs to go back and redo historically the 20 years of greenhouse gas inventories that we have on the books. I don't know, we haven't done that for any of the other proposed improvements to our inventory, and we don't need to do it for this one either. But
So-
we do need, it does need to be part of this group of improvements that we're looking at over the next several years as possible amendments to future inventories.
So I wonder, is there a recommendation from this committee to our the technical consultants, and we could make it formal, say here's a memo, this is our recommendation that when analyzing these options, you should use not zero for biomass. That's a whole different issue than how things are counted in the inventory. The second part is we've already covered is this is included in our RFI to investigate how to improve this for the inventory.
Sounds good to me.
And I guess the way that I would put it simply is, and Richard's pretty much already said this, that emissions today do not equal sequestration 10 years from now. And that if there, instead of a zero, there's a plus now and then a minus later, whether those two values are equal. I'm not exactly sure on the science, but there is that intervening period. And so I think these need to be reflected as two separate values, a plus and then a minus. So even if the total comes out to neutral, there's still that cost of having carbon in the air in the intervening period.
I see your point, and I think I agree with you. I am not sure how that plays out in a practical sense in the modeling that the EFG is doing. And the SEI models are, as far as I know, are capable of changing the emissions factor we assign. I don't know if they're capable of changing it annually, so you have kind of a graduated scale. Presumably they could, but I don't know if it would apply to historical measures. So that's a question, but I want to get, is this something that the greenhouse gas task group would write up, and then is this two questions, that one, and then if yes, is the subcommittee comfortable with that just going to the technical consultant without it having to come back to the subcommittee, or do we need to have it come back to the subcommittee first? Jared?
I wonder if it's possible to go back to the suggestion earlier around providing some, given that this is related, it's not the same question, but it is related to the life cycle and upstream emissions question. I wonder if it makes sense to try to frame up some questions related to what Richard is raising in that RFI. I certainly do not feel like I have the information at hand to confidently recommend a specific number or a specific change without hearing more information from potential RFI respondents or from, Ali Kasiba or others who've looked much more in depth at this question. So I feel like we need to find a way to identify ways to frame up the questions and get options and recommendations on the table. That's where I'm at. And would be happy to take up that question in the GHG task group and take an initial shot at drafting some of that language into the RFI, if that would be
Jared, is the uncertainty that the number, we don't know if the number is zero or plus or minus, or is the uncertainty around, well, we know that zero isn't right and that it is a positive number, but we don't know what that number is? In my experience, and if it's the latter approach where we know something is greater than zero, we might give our best estimate based on some information, but not leave it at 0, because we know that that is underselling it. And so whether it's, we get a bunch of, we see the literature and there's a range and we say, all right, we'll just take the low end of that range because we don't know. That to me is better than just saying 0 because we don't know, if we're confident that it is a positive number.
Yeah. The value of the number depends on how long you think it's going to take for the forest to replace the carbon you took out.
Right.
That's the key element.
Okay, so I think it's for the task group to come up. Maybe we won't be ready in a week, within a week, to send something to the technical consultant. I know that their analysis of options is coming to a close, I believe. And so, but they're,
Yeah,
go ahead, Jane.
my understanding is that the running of the fleet model, the last one, is going to be this Thursday or Friday with the changes. And the conversation now is around sensitivities.
Well,
Back
that's a
and
good
forth
place to
around
introduce the non-zero value when you're evaluating sensitivities.
Right. So if we could put a non-zero value in, maybe I would look to the greenhouse gas task group of this group to review, some of the materials that Richard's provided, other materials, maybe reach out to Ally and see what the value for that sensitivity should be.
That sounds appropriate and responsible. I like that idea.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. I did my best to facilitate that. Then I started to engage in the discussion. So it went predictably long, but we did have some room in the agenda for going on. We've used that all up now, and so we have to stay on task for the next pieces. And just to recap, that greenhouse gas task group will get together and review the materials and recommend a value for the technical consultant to use in sensitivity. Okay, great.
Yeah, and if Richard, if you don't mind kicking us off with a recommendation when we get there, we can follow up offline with Colin. It looks like he's not able to be on right now, and try to loop in Ally among others. But if you have a suggestion for a starting point of one or more values to consider and kind of, citations or resources as to why, that would be a helpful starting point.
I can do both a back of the envelope calculation and a bit of a literature review.
Thank you.
Great. And I would like to,
TJ,
go ahead, Jane.
well, I was just going to suggest that an immediate next step for you and I might be to circle up with SCI and David, because I just want to make sure that our understanding of timeline and how this could or couldn't fit in makes sense. I just got the sense this morning from my check-in with them that this is it this week, with the back and forth with SCI and Cadmus and ESG, that it's like shifting to report writing next week. So I just want to make sure, but that could be my limited understanding but my understanding around how the analyses are running and things like that. So there may not be room for sensitivity analysis, is what you're saying? That those are happening at the end of, yeah.
Oh, the sensitivities are happening this week.
Yeah.
I misunderstood
So
that.
using the social cost of carbon, and there was a question around that I was supposed to ask Jared I'll ask now Jared, TJ, and Ken Jones, maybe you're all here, around the idea perhaps of a population sensitivity, because right now the model assumes really minor population growth. I think I have it in my notes that something like by 2050, our population grows from 624 to 644, which is it's accurate if nothing changes dramatically, but possibly not. And so there were some questions around whether a significant population increase should be modeled as what that would do in different spaces. And I'm blanking right now on what the third sensitivity was, but you might know.
Right. So it seems like there's still time to shape the sensitivities if that question is out there.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's more value in this biomass sensitivity than the population sensitivity, although I do see that as being interesting, because I think that it just means more is needed. If there's a higher population, there's more vehicle miles traveled, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, this question seems more to provide more interesting results to me. Useful, not just interesting, but.
So I'll just check in real quick on the email right now on timeline and pop it in the chat too as you go on.
It is interesting. I'll just note very quickly that when I've reviewed emissions inventory reports from states that have seen significant population growth, let's say over the last decade, like Washington State or Oregon State, they oftentimes include a section on emissions intensity so that they're kind of normalizing looking at per capita emissions, because oftentimes, even when they're, taking measures to, reduce their carbon intensity or per person emissions, their aggregate emissions are going up as a result of, it's a partial result of that population increase. So it is something that like we may want to kind of, I don't think we're there yet, but it's an additional lens of analysis that can help us see trends and trajectories looking at carbon intensity in addition to the overall emissions reduction or emissions numbers.
Okay, so Jane, if you could follow up, if you get a response, we could circle back towards the end, but otherwise, I think the greenhouse gas task group has some tasks, and we can go from there, and we'll put this on the agenda for next week to follow up. Okay, so I tried this 10 minutes ago, but let's try and move on to our next topic on the agenda. So that's to discuss draft sections of the climate action plan. The two main draft sections that were asked to be drafted by your hard at work co-chairs were the social cost of carbon and cost of carbon review and the greenhouse gas inventory review, really summarizing what we did as a subcommittee and what we recommended. My plan is to pull these up on the screen and allow a couple minutes for folks to kind of internalize these because they did just get them. And so I will do that now with the cost of carbon first. Okay, so can people see my screen?
Yes.
So I'm just going to give a couple of minutes. Tell me when to scroll down, I guess.
Quickly, TJ, in that second paragraph, the sentence that begins after the quote from the National Academy of Sciences, it says the SDSC adopted the findings of the review. I think it's referencing the review before the review has been introduced. I don't think we say before that the review that was conducted by Energy Futures Group. Isn't that the review that that's
Yes. Yeah, it is.
I think we might just want to introduce that earlier, the name and title of that report, if it's going to be referenced there.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. If I put it up in the first paragraph after Vermont cap, it could be.
Oh, there's one tonight too.
We could just title it
It's everywhere.
what should we title it? The report, and then reference it as the report here.
Yeah, let me see if I can get the actual. I'll try to pull the actual title in real time. I'm using, thanks to Marion, the very handy search tool on the climatechange.vermont.gov website, which makes it very easy to find documents.
Really great. Do you have a minute to take on another comment while Jared's searching?
Sure.
I just wanted to frame how this document fits in the cap, and because I saw your opening sentence, which was sort of couching it in the work of science and data. But I did just want to suggest that the way that this section flows is that the title of the section in the cap is Scientific Decision-Making Tools and Recommendations. And at the beginning, I have Jared down as a summary of scientific underpinning of the cap, which was was intended to be a couple paragraphs that sort of speaks to the work broadly of science and data, the recognition perhaps that there wasn't a science and data subcommittee in the act, but it was, the rationale for why it was created and the body of work that it was supporting, both for the initial climate action plan and then perhaps long-term support of scientific and technical analysis for climate action. And so I just wanted to suggest that there is a space for a section that, albeit short, that sort of speaks to the role of science and data. And then, you could strike that whole first sentence here then, because this would be one section underneath that, and, sort of just say that, phrase it a little differently based on the fact that there would already have been a section that teed up the work of science.
I see. So it would be the Science and Data Subcommittee oversaw the development of, and then that would, because it's already, that first sentence is captured elsewhere. That's what you're saying.
Or it will be.
Will be. Yeah.
I'll just offer a very brief reflection. I don't know as though I have a so what or associated with it yet at this point, but I am noticing the tension as I drafted the section and as I see here, of like a desire on the one hand to kind of summarize our work and kind of report on it and kind of here are the key takeaways, versus putting ourselves in the shoes of the intended audience of this report and kind of introducing the broad issues. Because I think that to a large degree, diving in as we do here and diving in as my very rough draft does on the inventory kind of assumes a level of comfort and familiarity that we have all developed, but I'm not sure the report authors will. So I'm just struggling a little bit with how much kind of context setting and introduction to do on the concepts before we get to, and I'm not sure that we're there yet. I don't know the answer to that question. I'm just raising it as a consideration that I'm wrestling with.
Yeah, that is, I think, an excellent comment. And, you know, if we got pushed back on the council yesterday from some of the sections that Marion and I drafted for this week, and like those were really not technically heavy compared to this. And so and really the intent is to break down the subcommittees through this process and speak more broadly to climate action and policy. You know, there'll be a section up front in the climate action plan that I'm responsible for writing around process. So the recognition that there were these 5 subcommittees, but each of them were working on at a high level. And this is really intended not to be about the subcommittee itself, but about the work and how people consume it and why it's important for climate action. Yeah. More guidance from me and would have been better on that, so sorry. And seeing the most current draft would help for contextual aspects of the different components.
So, so with that comment, it might be, you know, when I skim through this again and I see, you know, we defined what the social cost of carbon is for people, and then what damage-based approach is, and then say we should do it using, you know, this other research that has been done. Seems pretty high level, but where we don't kind of explain for a more general audience is the term discount rates and what that means.
Yep.
And so maybe there's a you know, a little more explanation there warranted.
I think that makes sense.
So TJ, I sent you some comments earlier today. I hope they're not reflected in this document, but I hope you have them.
I do. So let me just pull that up. I did send a response, but only like an hour before the meeting. So
my main concern,
scroll back up right here. Yeah.
My main concern, which other than wordsmithing, had to do with the fact that we say that the consultant looked at your agency's model, and then we don't say any more about it.
Right. So my response really was that, so I'm just going to scroll here on your screen, is after the table here, there's another page where we talk about the review of the tool. So I'm not sure if you saw that.
I'm sorry. I thought that table was the end of the document. I apologize.
Others, please jump in if you have anything. But TJ, I wanted to offer a suggestion up above, the footnote number 2. My recollection of where we ended on that question was that it was not entirely clear whether we were looking at a social cost of carbon dioxide equivalent, or whether in line with what we expect, what looks like may come out of the federal interagency working group, that will be more appropriate to have social costs of specific greenhouse gases. And I think we should just leave open the possibility that it would be one or the other. And it looks like in the initial recommendations from the interagency working group, you know, there is a social cost of methane that's specific to methane and of nitrous oxide rather than, you know, converting that to CO2 equivalent. So I think that footnote is probably something like emissions other than CO2 should either be converted to carbon dioxide equivalent emissions or have their own individual, social cost of that greenhouse gas value assigned to them pending the recommendations of further research, including the federal interagency working group that's looking deeply at this.
So I don't disagree with your comment there. I just want to point out, I took this footnote directly from what I thought to be the subcommittee's recommendation to the full council. And so maybe it got changed after that.
I think my recollection was that EFG, I don't know if David or Gabrielle are on, was that language got updated after because it was on that last call when we were presenting the recommendations, when I think George, among others, pointed to what was happening in New York, and in kind of real time, we realized that language might not be correct. And I believe that had been updated in the final draft of the social cost of carbon report. But
right, it may have been updated in the report, but did it get updated in our memo? And does that matter? So I don't want to report something that we didn't provide to the full council when the full council may have adopted another memo. And so if I had does that make sense? Or maybe that's not a concern. Maybe it shouldn't be a concern.
I think we want to reflect the most recent and accurate framing of that, would be my recommendation. And if it's helpful, I mean, I know it's difficult to kind of change words in real time. I'm happy to kind of suggest it after this meeting, suggested track changed or alternate wording to capture that, if that's helpful.
Yeah, I mean,
the goal now would be just discussing that overall intent,
right.
recognizing that it's still a bit of an open question, and we want to leave the door open to one of those two approaches.
Okay. That needs to be wordsmithed some more, but I wanted to put it in there for the point. I'm okay with doing that, subject to, I still want to, so if we recommended something, the full council is going to say, hey, this is not, they may say, this is not what you recommended, and now you're sticking it in the report. And that's just the concern. And so I don't, it may be in the final report, but it is not, it's a different, this language, this 1, 2, and 3 is like straight from the memo that we sent to them, including the footnote.
I do know that when I presented on this on our behalf at the council, I specifically said this. I don't know if it ended up in the written language, but it should be in the minutes, and certainly would be on the video of that presentation. So it would be consistent with what was presented to them, to the full council.
All right, I'm going to scroll down. This is the third prong of that. And then the table is included. Third prong, plan for updating regularly. And then this is the language on the cost of carbon tool.
looks good.
Okay, so with regard to this, Richard, you had offered a couple of other edits. Do you want to talk about those? I can bring them up if you want to.
Well, you know, I viewed them as wordsmithing, and they're not substantive.
Okay, so can I just my understanding is the timing of this is that the hope was to have this before the full council next week. Is that right, Jane? Or do we, so for next week?
It's supposed to be posted Tuesday, a week before the next council meeting where they'll be discussed. So these aren't being discussed actually until the following week. So if there was an extraordinary case that they couldn't be posted till Wednesday after your meeting, you would only be a day off schedule.
Okay. Well, I think this one, what I'd like to do is with you know, if the committee agrees to modify that footnote and then to just add a little explanation to what discount rates are, that it just be that folks can give me the leave to do that and then have it posted and be ready for the full council for kind of a week from Tuesday, I suppose. So are there objections to the subcommittee not seeing this draft again with those minor changes? So hearing none, we'll just for the minutes, the substance of this was approved and minor changes will be made as discussed, and we'll post it for the subcommittee meeting. It'll get posted by next Tuesday, and then it will be the subcommittee meeting, the full council meeting the following week.
It all sounds good. Thanks for pulling this together, TJ.
Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing, and now I'm going to. Do you want to pull up the greenhouse gas one? Do you have that up, Jared? Or
I do. Yeah, just give me one sec. Folks, see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. So, similar to TJ's approach, I very much wanted to base this draft on our consensus recommendations and the language that was already in our recommendations to the full council. I did offer a little bit of kind of context setting here beforehand, but there's a couple of places where I made slight word changes for the sake of flow and readability. I don't believe that they're really material, but I'm happy to flag those when we get to them. But for now, let's just focus on any comments on this first part, these first two paragraphs.
So just, this is kind of a non-substantive comment. It's more style, but talking about for the final report, it seems like we shouldn't talk about we. We should just gonna be statements of, so it's to ensure the state meets its requirements. It is vitally important. We don't have to have we believe or
I'm also going to delete the word vitally since that phrase was already used.
Jared, my question is about, and maybe it comes in down below, but thinking about how this fits with other regional and national level inventories.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that
Oh, I
this
see. There it is.
part was
Okay,
intended. Yeah.
perfect.
Are folks okay if I move down to the starting with one, or are there any other comments on the first couple of paragraphs? Okay, I'm going to move down.
Yeah, as I read one, I'm not sure that quite gets at it. I mean, I think it makes an important point, but do we want to? It's not really for consistency and alignment, right? It's almost like I would say with an eye towards. I know that's not the kind of language we want to use in a formal report, but in light of the IPCC and EPA peer states is appropriate or consistent with.
Yeah, I just want to note, I think this is a similar question to what TJ had. This is the language that was directly from our recommendation. So I do think that if we all are comfortable with it, it's certainly within our kind of purview to change this language on the fly, especially if the full council will be reviewing it. I do want to note that this is directly taken from what we had already approved by consensus and presented to the council.
Oh, then I withdraw my, no need to
I think
backtrack.
you're right, though. I agree, Julie, with the intent that could be clearer. I'm happy to do it. I just there is potentially that wrinkle of changing language that was already approved and presented.
Yep. I don't feel strongly enough about it that I would think it's worth backtracking.
I will say this number 2 originally had a second sentence here that said, there will be further recommendations forthcoming about the carbon budget related to the task 2 report, which I didn't feel like was appropriate here. So I just ended this sentence here. But otherwise, 3, 4, and 5 are the exact same. Except in 3, it had originally said as part of the next published in-boundary inventory. And that struck me as an oversight that actually we're talking about supplemental information and sensitivity analysis for future inventories on an ongoing basis. We wouldn't just do it for the next one, but presumably we would want that supplemental information and sensitivity analysis on an ongoing basis whenever an inventory is produced. So
that one I might push back on a little bit in terms of, if we, well, I guess they would still be okay in this language. I just don't want to create the expectation of doing a life cycle analysis every year.
This isn't speaking to life cycle. That's down in the section below.
Or
the supplemental information here is mostly these sensitivity analyses around different AR values, GWP value.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I was.
Yeah.
I didn't reread the ABC there. So.
Good. Okay, so I'm gonna go. And then so here, I really tried to change the language from like, here's what we're recommending for RFIs to here's the additional information we that should be gathered to inform our work going forward, and really summarizing those. Sorry, it's difficult to see, but I'm just going to leave it there, I guess.
To the point that was made earlier about explaining this more in layman's terms,
Yeah.
this one I think is actually a lot harder than the social cost of carbon, which really only had two terms to define that and discount rates. There's a lot of jargon in here,
Yeah.
and I'm not sure how to deal with that. I just wanted to point it out that, adopt key category analysis for future inventories is, for instance, somebody just reading the report is not going to know what that means.
Yep.
And even, I don't know how far into the weeds we go. It's Rex could also be something. But I just saw George's comment pop up on my screen actually, and I think it's worth sharing now. Is he asked if there's a glossary of terms, and so maybe that's a way to deal with that.
Yeah, I think this is not going to be limited to our bits.
Yeah.
The need to have that information.
So maybe it's really just, I don't know if defined terms are in like bold in the report or something, or capitalized, but we could come up with definitions later and put them in there in the glossary, as long as we know that they're defined terms.
Yeah. Jane, do you or Marion have advice on that? Has that come up yet?
We have a section for a glossary, but we haven't had a process question around how to flag components that are being drafted now to elevate words that would need to be included in, or terminology for the glossary. I like the idea of just bolding it or highlighting it, and Marion's making improvements to the CAP drafting process based on our conversation with the council yesterday.
Yeah.
And that's something we could actually flag for her to include when drafting sections, if there are terms that should be included in the glossary to highlight.
Okay. I'm just going to highlight these right now so we don't, if there's any others that, there's a lot of this could be.
Yeah, just highlight the whole thing.
I know it's kind of difficult to know where to draw this line, but okay. So go back to here. So again, this is really the same language, just with the RFI portions taken out of it for A and B. And then it ends.
Back to TJ's prior point, there's a "we" up in the introductory paragraph to this.
Oh, yeah. That good? Great. I guess one thing that I do wonder about is this report, I would defer to you, Julie and Jane, is this report a place where we want to surface recommendations that will require action from the legislature and or administration, specifically related to allocating resources to enable, for instance, this to be done? I think that we've identified the step of an RFI and getting definitional and raising some of these key questions and getting options on the table. But in terms of actually conducting that, I wonder if there's a place, if it's worth noting that additional resources will presumably be necessary to enable that. And does that get pulled out and either highlighted here and or pulled out and included in another set of recommendations? I don't know.
It's a really good question. I mean, I think it's important to flag things that will have resource requirements, whether that's human resource or like contractor / financial resources to implement. And I think we probably ultimately need to aggregate them somewhere. It's almost like we'll have a set of, I'd have to go back maybe in Jane and look at the outline, the overall outline, but I think sort of in where we're starting to lay out implementation actions, there's probably a section that says sort of future study. I don't know, right? And like is a placeholder.
Mhm.
Further areas where further analysis and study is required.
Trying to get rid of the we, sorry. Sorry, where was that, Julie?
The we or the what I'm suggesting.
What you're suggesting, sorry,
I actually, I think we'd have to go open up the outline Jane has for the overall climate action plan document and see if there's sort of a place. I think the fact that you've highlighted, Jared, and just have it as a flat, like a reminder to look for wherever this is, but that we need to aggregate these things somewhere. Because if there's a dozen recommendations for additional technical analysis or expanded work in whatever space by staff that do or don't presently exist, it needs to be sort of put forward as a comprehensive package for the administration and legislature to take up as part of their work on the budget.
Yeah.
Yeah, we flagged this. I mean, this morning we made the choice to flag capacity and workforce as a cross-cutting issue and lift it up into that because there are actions associated with like directing to think about how, capacity at different levels as well as workforce. So that got flagged up into the body of the pathway strategies and actions, but we flagged scientific data and data analysis, further analysis, but we didn't actually put that there. And I guess I see it, I could see it going either way, like as a cross-cutting pathway to recognizing that further technical analysis is needed to advance work in many spaces. And therefore we should be thinking about it collaboratively in order to prioritize it based on limited resources. But then if there are immediate needs, that's where I feel like shifting it down into the implementation section where we speak to funding needs directly gets important in how you make that distinction. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, I guess I see it, Jane, as an implementation need. I'm happy to be told other people feel strongly otherwise. But to the extent that there are a number of these items that we're discussing that are, to my mind, kind of critical path pieces to some larger decisions that need to get made ultimately.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to lay them out as such.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like that's a bigger question for now. We can just kind of flag that there is likely one of those pieces in this section. Took an initial shot at getting rid of the we in that the two we's in the last two sentences in that last paragraph. But would welcome any other suggestions or comments?
Oh, there's a we in that first paragraph too. Understanding the emissions that we can fairly be understood to be responsible for. That Vermont is probably right.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't even. Is that-
Line 60, down, line 62. Having these line numbers is super helpful.
Yeah,
In line 60, you could replace our should probably go to the.
Yeah.
Okay, so is this, it sounds like substantively where this committee is okay with this, and maybe with that one flag to review as to where to kind of make sure that the issue gets highlighted, that resources are needed. Let me just pause to confirm that. Is there?
and if anybody wants me to put it back up, just let me know. I thought it would be easier to see each other though.
So I'm not hearing any substantive issues. So I guess
It looks like,
would.
sorry, TJ, I just want to pause because it looks like Colin is back on. I had meant to send this to Colin beforehand, but only had this ready like a half hour before the meeting started. So I just want to make sure that Colin feels comfortable with how the inventory was presented, because I don't know when you were able to come back on, Colin. It looked like you had been off for a little bit, and if you want additional time, that would be great.
Thanks, Jared. Yeah, I just topped back on a couple minutes ago, so I'm going to have to certainly spend a little more time with that document, but appreciate you flagging it for me.
Okay, well, I'll plan to update this and send the revised version that has the track changes that we just did in real time back to the subcommittee and Jane and Marion.
Okay, great. That was good progress. Thank you. So next up on our agenda is the monitoring and assessment task group. Update and next steps. So I am aware that group met. Not sure if anybody is prepared, or if, I don't know, to actually update the committee on what happened. Trying to think of who is actually on that. I think it's Jane, Colin, Claire might be on it, to see where we are.
There's a whole slew of us this year, Richard and Jared.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I am a part of the group, but I missed the meeting.
Yeah. So I'm happy to start it, and I'd appreciate if others, especially Claire and Jared, on behalf of the Public Service Department's work and EAN's work, could fill in any details. But just from a process standpoint, originally we had outlined, and Colin was at that meeting too, so thanks, yeah, recognizing that we have a lot of different tools in front of us, and being consistent on what they all are doing and not doing, versus the inventory versus the LEAP model versus a measuring in progress tool. We got together and spoke about recognition that originally within the contract for EFG and CADMIS, this was intended to be done, the tool drafted and complete by middle of November, to be included with the climate action plan. Because of other priorities, there's been a recognition and appreciation that this can wait a bit. And at this point, what we're putting forward is the idea of collaboration on what a framework for how a tool that would measure and track progress in the mitigation space, specifically emissions reductions, would be advanced in a timely manner after December 1st, but that the framework for that tool would be included and adopted as part of the climate action plan. And in addition to the framework itself, the tracking emissions reductions, we'd also be identifying the gaps in which the tool isn't measuring and tracking progress in, namely resilience and adaptation and other spaces, and think about a process for how we would advance measuring and tracking progress with respect to actions in that space as well for future iterations. There's been a lot of progress, though, and it sounds like we can build off of what you all started, TJ and Claire, in advancing work from the Public Service Department that was assimilating data from EAN and thinking about how to sort of pick up that work so that ultimately we would have the same tool informing progress for both the Public Service Department and the Climate Action Plan. Hopefully I've captured that kind of right, but Claire, it'd be great just to hear from you if you are available about sort of the work to date by the Public Service Department and then how we would coordinate it moving forward. But I did, Liz, in our check-in this morning with EFG and Cadmus, Liz took this on and is proposing having a summary of those notes and a framework developed for another meeting of this group on October 21st at 9 o'clock in the morning. So she was going to email you all to see if that date and time works for us getting back together on this. I think that's next week. Oh my God. When I heard it this morning, I thought it was 2 weeks away.
Yeah, and I would just note to add to that, I think one of the key areas of focus for this task is, with regard to tracking emissions reduction, clearly, in the end, in terms of compliance with the GWSA, it is going to be what shows up in the inventory. But there was a recognition that there are lags in terms of, if, right now we're in 2021 and we have data through 2018. And so if we get to will it be until 2020? It may not be until 2027 or 2028 that we have the data in the inventory that says, here's what our emissions were in 2025. So I think a key goal of this task is to say, what information do we have in closer to real time that allows us to get an initial read on how we're doing with progress to goals in the lead up, especially connected to the pathways, strategies, and actions that are being presented. There is really good data out there in terms of, number of homes comprehensively weatherized and an assessment of the emissions reduction of that, of number of heat pumps and other kind of pieces of equipment that reduce emissions installed through things like Efficiency Vermont rebate tracking data, the number of different types of vehicles registered and the emissions profile of them. So I do think, a key part of what this group will be focusing on is saying, what are those data sources that can give us an initial read to have a sense of where we are on or off track with regard to some of those pathways and strategies and actions, and not be in the position of kind of being 2 or 3 years behind until full federal data sets are available and the comprehensive inventory is updated.
So just a question, I guess, is that you frame that, Jared, in kind of monitoring and assessment towards tracking of our goals, which I think is a primary purpose of the effort, but also we talked a lot about data gaps. And I know other subcommittees have too. And I just want to make sure that we're not losing that thread. I don't think you are. You just haven't. You didn't say it just then.
Agreed.
There's a lot of good reasons to gather that data to better design the mitigation options and to better understand kind of the distribution of the burdens and benefits of the current infrastructure and the mitigation options. So. Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, Jared did a brilliant job of describing this. In the world from which I came, the public health world, we used to talk about determining whether we were doing the right things and whether we were doing things right. And those are two different aspects of monitoring. One is, are the programs being implemented as designed? And then, given that they're implemented as designed, are they achieving the desired effect? And those are both important parts of monitoring.
Great. So the framework then, and I think I agree with that path of outlining the framework and maybe those purposes and guiding principles of what that framework is intended to achieve in the plan, and not kind of being done by December 1st. So that's well, it's practical, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I just would add, and I just flagged this for Jane too. I would encourage us to do a little bit of lessons learned around the clean water monitoring and assessment framework that we've set up. I think there were a lot of places where we would have been well served to have kind of thought several steps further ahead than we have, and have started the work necessary to develop some of the tools Jared's describing as early as possible, and are probably in a position 5 years into that kind of heavy implementation effort to think pretty critically about what we would do differently if we had it to do all over again. And flag that for Jane, but I think maybe a conversation involving a couple of key staff from that program that have been really intimately involved in trying to track that same kind of scale of work, and also be credible absent the long-term data set that we get much delayed and down the road, could be really valuable to this conversation, I think, and our overall effort.
Okay. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention is Jane referenced some work that the department has been doing. I think it's important to note that was really based on the work, a lot of the work that, well, at least part of it was based on a lot of the work that EAN had been doing. And so that they were kind of hoping to transition that to this more of this framework of a database for all of our comprehensive database for all of our energy and climate programs. And so I don't know that we have time to get into the details of that, but I guess if folks are interested, they could reach out to the department, and Claire's heading up that project for us. All right. Thank you all. Next up on the agenda is just circling back on the proportional reduction in emissions. Just following up from the September 29th meeting. We had discussed language, just to refresh folks, to potentially forward to the council on how proportionality is considered, to address some of the concern raised in discussions with Ag and Eco. I think we got to a spot where the interpretation of the GWSA didn't specify the priority of one criterion over another, but the council could do that, and the committee said that we would recommend to the council an interpretation that makes it clear that proportionality shouldn't take precedence over other considerations. So I'm just kind of summarizing what the minutes said there, and I guess a subgroup was going to convene. I'm not sure that has had the opportunity to happen yet, but
That was,
Jared, I know you have some thoughts on this.
well, I was just going to, the fact that that hasn't happened is my fault. Megan had helpfully followed up to try to do that, and I just got overwhelmed last week. But I do think that it would still be helpful for us to put forward, to signal as a committee. I think that there is this, and this came up again at the council meeting earlier this week, this question of proportional reductions by sector. It came up specific to what is the reference year that we use to say, you know, what emissions came from what sector in which year, because of course, you know, the share of our total emissions that are coming from different sectors is changing over time, and the share that came from the industrial sector versus the transportation sector is different in 1990, 2005, and in more recent data. So, you know, I have put forward a couple of times, including at the council meeting, a suggestion that for various reasons we consider using the most recent available data, but that's a very specific question with regard to the reference year. I think the bigger question that I've heard come up in these conversations, and if there is broad agreement on it, I think it would be good to kind of, you know, memorialize in some formal way, is an interpretation, just a plain reading of the law that, you know, in 10 VSA 592, section D2, there are 8 objectives listed for what should be contained in the climate action plan. The very first one says to prioritize the most cost-effective, technologically feasible, and equitable greenhouse gas emissions reduction pathways, ... Then it talks about relative, not strict, not equal, relative contributions of each source or category of source of emissions. And then there are 6 other objectives. And, you know, the law, it does not read to me as though one is preferenced or elevated above another, that all 8 of those are objectives that should be furthered. I just think that there should be some common sense appreciation of when and if there are not cost-effective, technologically feasible, or equitable greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategies or actions within a certain source or category, that we shouldn't dogmatically, you know, cling to the proportional share by sector, because there are all of these other objectives to consider alongside that. And that I think that there's this sense, because we need to figure out the proportional share by sector for the modeling exercise. I think some people see that or fear that as kind of a rigid, like, okay, so this sector has to do exactly this. I think we need to be clear that there has to be some more, that can be one of the 8 objectives, but there need to be other criteria considered in terms of what we're actually putting forward and where we get the emissions reductions, taking into account all of those other objectives that are also listed in the law.
Ian, is your hand up for this? Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to suggest that I spoke to Commissioner Walk this morning about this task or this component of work, and his suggestion, he had asked me to work with his assistant to schedule a meeting for a group that was identified. It sounded like essentially at the meeting yesterday at the Climate Council, and folks who volunteered to lean in and help of his staff. So it was Brian Patch, Jared, Commissioner Walk, Megan O'Toole, and Colin, who agreed to think about both the baseline year and the proportionality question in order to raise and come to a decision and recommendation to the council and flag. I think, Julie, you may have suggested also in your conversations with Peter around also flagging other considerations that should be raised and elevated with respect that might need legislative attention.
Thanks for that, Jane.
Anyway, so I'm telling you that I'm taking it off your plate, Jared, to schedule the meeting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And so my recollection is that one, we didn't discuss the baseline issue here in this subcommittee, but that, well, at least as reflected in the notes as well, is that we all agreed that with the perspective that Jared, you just outlined on the proportionality, that it shouldn't take precedence essentially over the other objectives. Your summary was much more nuanced than that, but I don't think we had any disagreement. And so if there's this other group working on it, what I feel like this subcommittee could do is let Jared, you know, I don't know how we do this, but authorize Jared as part of that group to say, hey, this full subcommittee kind of agrees with this concept. And, you know, the Science and Data Subcommittee have already, you know, talked about the proportionality, and we think we should address it this way. Is there concerns with that approach? You know, I feel like it could help kind of like knock one of the things you all need to address off the, you know, off the list. I don't hear any concerns. So Jared, I think you have the subcommittee's full support on that portion. Do you want to draw the distinction of the reference here, which we didn't talk about? So, but and I know well, I think there may be some differing opinions on reference here. So, so I think that's helpful. I don't know if there's other things related to that, given that there's another group that's going to dive in, that we need to talk about that further here. Although I'm open to it if folks have a burning desire.
I'm okay to move on to, I would like to see if we can touch on this TCI question before we move to public comment.
Yeah, so we do still have, so we have maybe 10 minutes before, maybe 15 before public comment. So there's that question, and then we could circle back on the sensitivities question. Jane had put something in the chat on that as well. If maybe we could just do that really quickly here. So in the chat, it looked like you got a response, Jane, that said that they could do 2 this week. And right now they're prioritizing social cost of carbon, emissions from HQ, and I have it in front of me. One other.
A possible increase in Vermont population growth rate.
Population, right.
But that one would come later.
Right. To me, the sensitivity in emissions for biomass is actually more critical than any of those other ones. I don't know exactly how to move forward on it. What's that?
Completely speculative, but I just want to let you know what David's response was around the idea of it. And this is speculative, and he acknowledges that, but he says that I'm guessing that compared to others, a biomass sensitivity will have a relatively small impact on total outcomes, but that is speculation. I think that both the hydro and biomass emissions factor is missing some of the bigger picture. Again, that is speculation. And when possible, we will include them as sensitivities and see how large a difference they actually make.
So the reason I would prioritize biomass, even if it is speculative, is that biomass sensitivity is kind of contained in the heating, and it's not a it's not as much of a, the reason to check do a sensitivity on HQ is if the life cycle emissions are much bigger than thought. And maybe I don't understand the issue fully, but it's not, with biomass, it's not a question of life cycle versus burner tip. It's I'm losing my train of thought. I apologize, but I think that the issues are different. And when you talk about HQ, you're talking about electric resource, and you're doing a sensitivity on one electric resource and not all the electric resources on their life cycle versus burner tip. So you're not looking at solar or storage or nuclear or what have you, and that seems strange to me. But Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, I said this in chat a little earlier, but let's suppose that we account properly, in my opinion, in my view, for carbon dioxide released by burning wood for heat, and it's non-zero, but we decide that's okay, that we still want to have wood for heat because for all the reasons that Jared enunciated, we still think it's important even though it's non-zero. That's fine. But that does mean then that if we're trying to reduce the overall greenhouse gases from heating buildings, we have to do something else. We have to insulate them better. We have to keep them at a lower temperature. We have to switch more of them to electric heat pumps. We have to, we have to do something else.
Right. Lou, go ahead.
TJ, to your point of determining what really is sensitivity, what comes to mind for me, and I don't know where the line would be drawn exactly, but I think there's some distinction you can make between use or combustion and storage of fuel compared to transportation and use of materials for construction. In my mind, there's some delineation there, but I'm not sure exactly where that line would fall for our purposes.
Yeah, I guess, in thinking through what a lot of stakeholders have been raising in terms of concerns about, wanting to see upstream or life cycle analysis that will not be ready for this first iteration of the cap, unfortunately. I do think it would be really valuable to prioritize sensitivity analysis around the primary sources of electricity generation that are cause for concern in those conversations, which are Hydro-Quebec and are sometimes nuclear. And I will just say, and natural gas. It's a good, yes. But although, yes, no, that's a good point, because the current analysis would just be treating it as a burner tip emissions at the kind of site or facility level and not upstream. Yeah, I agree with that addition, Richard. I would just say, I expect that the natural gas life cycle emissions would be significant and worth knowing about. Our senior fellow Lee Seddon at EAN has done an initial analysis looking at the peer-reviewed studies that are available in terms of assessing life cycle emissions factors for both hydro and nuclear. And the latest kind of most comprehensive studies that seem to be available on the hydro side, it's the Levasseur et al. Study, and on the nuclear side, it's the EON study. And what his initial analysis shows is that even if you use a life cycle emissions factor for hydro, which would be like 46 pounds per megawatt hour, based on that Levasseur paper, and for nuclear of about 50 pounds per megawatt hour, which accounts for things related to uranium mining, and for instance. I think it is important for folks to have a sense of the scale of what those emissions are compared to the ISO New England grid as a whole. It's like, depending on how you measure it, the pounds per megawatt hour of the ISO New England grid mix. That's not, what we're purchasing, but what the residual grid mix is like 800 to 1,100 pounds per megawatt hour. So yes, totally important and fair to say hydro, nuclear are not zero. But even if you put in those life cycle factors, it would not be appropriate. It would be an apples to oranges comparison. But even if you put in those life cycle factors for those resources into our inventory, the net result would basically be that electricity sector emissions go from 2% of our total emissions to 2.25% of our total emissions. So yes, let's have the transparency on this so people don't think that that there's more opportunity than there may be in certain areas of our electricity sector to reduce emissions. Compared to other strategies that very significantly and directly reduce emissions when we're getting rid of fossil fuel combustion.
I think that's really helpful, Jared. Richard, go ahead. I have a comment, but your hand was up first.
Just really quickly, my posture all along is that we should be treating all these energy sources the same way. And when we do that and we get things, in my view, right, it won't make much of a difference for some of them. And for others, it will make a big difference. But we need to treat them the same way.
Yeah, that was part of the gist of my comment, is that we need to treat all the resources the same way. And I think that there's a desire to pick out a couple of resources, but leave others alone. And even within the electric sector, that could have implications on the policies that are chosen that may not have emissions, it may not actually have big emissions implications in reality, but they could drive a conversation that isn't based on a complete set of information.
Right, and just tagging off of that, I guess, given that we are working under a time constraint, I wonder if there are policy implications for sequencing certain sensitivities first in this first round, absent complete analysis of other life cycles or of other generation types, such that legislators could make decisions. And maybe this is not our call to make, but legislators could make decisions based on something that is supposed, and a sensitivity analysis could show that supposition is not in fact wholly accurate, where other potential suppositions are not up on the policy table as of yet, if that makes sense.
So I'm not sure where to go on this, because I actually am not sure that we were asked for our input on sensitivities, but we did want to communicate that we think it's important that there be that biomass be included in the sensitivities, and maybe we can communicate that. I don't know if everybody agrees with me that it should be the top priority for a sensitivity, but we could just at least say that it should be a sensitivity.
Would you not agree that the social cost of carbon should be the top sensitivity?
So I see that as doing the analysis, and then the results are X amount of emissions are saved, and then you put a dollar value on it, and that putting the dollar value on it should happen in every situation. And I suppose you could say, here's the range of dollar values under different discount rates, but that's less of a sensitivity to me of saying biomass has, much more emissions than we originally said of zero, and that could actually change the mix of measures that we put in. The social cost of carbon could change the cost benefit analysis, but
right.
That's a hard one for me to kind of put in the sensitivity box.
That makes sense to me, the way you explained it.
So I think, I guess, Jane, if you want to take the feedback back of this conversation to EFG, or I'm happy to do that also, but it's kind of for what it's worth, the subcommittee talked about this and thinks biomass should be a sensitivity. And so I'll take that
I'd
as
be interested to hear if you all agree if it's your consensus for your top one. Just so I can push that.
do folks agree that biomass would be the top priority for a sensitivity, or no? And if the answer is no, then I don't know that we have time for lots of discussion on it, but just to.
What were the other items on the table? Just list them quickly.
Yeah, it was including a social cost of carbon, including a non-zero emissions for Hydro-Quebec, or a possible increase in Vermont population growth rate.
Yeah. Then I think that the question of sensitivity to biomass carbon dioxide release is the number one, although I think all four of them are important.
I guess I would just quickly offer, I think I think we need the social cost of carbon analysis in there. And I agree with TJ that doesn't feel to me like a sensitivity analysis. It's just core to the modeling. So as long as that's not part of the list, I'm okay with that, especially because, the benefit of focusing on the wood side is that gives us more information for the thermal sector, rather than kind of picking out a life cycle emissions factor for one electricity resource to do a sensitivity analysis on versus another, which kind of feels inappropriate until we can do more comprehensive and holistic analysis across the board.
Julie or Lou, do you want to weigh in, or are you good with that?
Yeah, me too.
Okay. Thank you all. So we have 9 minutes left. Jared, sorry, I kind of took prerogative to get that sensitivity question just because it was time sensitive for this week.
Sense.
Why don't you tee up the issue, and then
Yeah.
we can at least.
Let me go ahead and share my screen. Can folks see this document?
Yes.
So sorry, I have not shared this with the subcommittee yet, but these were some initial thoughts I put together on this question related to basically what's coming up is we have set a prioritization framework that includes how we assess impact high, medium, and low for different emissions reduction measures. And the question has come up, how would we assess the Transportation and Climate Initiative program, or Vermont's participation in it, given that it is designed as a regional program, and the target, as you can see here, this is language taken directly from the TCI website. What the cap in the system of allowances would ensure is a 30% reduction in on-road transportation emissions from 2023 levels by 2032. But that would be across the region formed by whatever the participating states are. And so the question came up, well, how would Vermont count that? My first thought is I think we need to break this into two pieces. One is, how do we do that retrospectively? And I don't see a rationale or an appropriate way to kind of count our emissions differently than we're already doing in the inventory. Looking at kind of what fuel sales have been, whether they're declining, whether we see declines in fossil fuel use and increases in low or no carbon alternatives. But there's a separate question, which is in assessing the potential impact of Vermont's potential participation in the TCIP program, what should we put in as the placeholder for potential emissions reduction? And so, I think there's a couple of things it's not clear to me, and I'd be curious to hear from Brian, who I see has his hand up, and others from the state who've been more directly involved in the TCI program and modeling. But it's not clear to me what basis there would be for assuming that Vermont's share of emissions reduction would be any lower than is projected for the region as a whole. I think a couple of the complicating factors in this are there's really emissions reduction that can come through a variety of paths. One is directly from the cap and the regional fuel suppliers complying with that cap and reduced emissions. But then, of course, there is also the expected revenue that each state would have significant latitude of how to invest in emissions reducing activities. And, my understanding is that the share of revenue that Vermont receives would be relatively proportional to our overall participation in the program. It's not, I guess, I just want to raise this question. I'm jumping ahead with some of my own kind of questions, assumptions, but I guess I just wanted to raise this topic for discussion in this group to see if others have information that would be helpful or thinking about this in a different way, because I think we need to have some objective, kind of confident basis for which we can assess the potential emissions reduction impact of Vermont's participation in that program, which is emerging as one of the top recommendations of the Transportation Task Group Subcommittee. I think there's some more complications there. It's kind of, since it has 2023 levels projecting what would our emissions be in 2023. I can send this out afterwards, but I think the basic thing is I just did a conservative back of the envelope estimate of, assuming Vermont's reductions were in line with what we'd expect for the region, it's, and this is 2032, not 2030, but, it's maybe somewhere on the order of an 830,000 ton reduction, whereas the threshold for a high impact reduction is only 346. So even if you used all of the most conservative assumptions, that number is still far beyond the high impact threshold, but I may be missing something, and I'd be curious if folks think I am or have additional information to provide. Brian.
Hi, Jared. Thanks for sharing. I don't want to take up a tremendous amount of time with this. I think you're on the right track. I didn't hear the repeat of the context, but forgive me if it got raised before. The Transportation Task Group is working on the prioritization exercise for the cross-sector mitigation, and needs to be able to evaluate this and their other proposals with the prioritization methodology that was shared with the cross-sector group. My understanding is that methodology is still under review because of what happened with the electricity evaluation, and things are getting screened out that maybe weren't intended. So that's the context, is how do we prioritize these as high, medium, and low for the purposes of the plan? And then in particular, how do you score a program like participation in the Transportation and Climate Initiative in Vermont, where the cap is regional? I think you're on the right track with this, Jared. There's a couple of nuances, particularly the cap regionally isn't what emissions are. So please don't conflate those two. And then of course, I think it's a little clearer that everybody's allowance budget doesn't act as a state cap. But certainly the concept that because of the way we would reduce emissions in Vermont, because of particularly the places where we would do it versus more developed areas that have transit and rail and stuff like that is different. I think that's potentially compelling. I don't know how that works into the scoring criteria yet, but I think this is one piece of evidence with some refinement on the numbers that I don't really want to get into that suggests that participation could be high. The other thing I want to mention quickly is the program works by establishing this regional cap and state budgets, but that the primary mechanism for the emissions reductions is going to be the investment of the proceeds, and how you invest them it results in what your emissions reductions are going to be. And the investment, we have some investment profiles in a tool that was developed for the TCI program that I'm working with, some sample scenarios for investments that I can work down to the state level. But exactly what we're going to do, nobody really knows yet, although the Transportation Task Group is talking about in things like investment in EVs and, and transportation demand management and things like that. So we have this. I think this is a kind of a higher level analysis of how you can get to scoring it as high. I have this TCI tool, this investment strategy tool that I'm working with, that I think it gets you to the same place in a different way. And then I'm also really interested in talking to EFG, because I went through the LEAP model 1.63, it's not the latest one, and tried to estimate what transportation reductions are in their mitigation pathway. And at least transportation as a whole looks like it also meets the high threshold as well. But it's three different methodologies with three different packages of assumptions behind them. We've talked about, different kinds of fruit. We are definitely not talking about apples and apples in this case.
Right.
But for the purposes of the exercise, I'm not entirely sure what's the evidence or the reference that's required in order to be able to say this action is something that ranks as high. But we're going to work on that. So there's definitely approaches to do it. They're all quantitative at some level, and I think I'll leave it at that and either let others comment or ask questions.
Thanks, Brian. TJ?
So I just wanted to, I guess I'll emphasize one of the points that Brian made is that, you can correct me if I got this wrong, but that the TCI emissions reductions really come from the investments that are made with the revenue stream. And so, when it gets to counting our emissions reductions, like via the inventory or even modeling the emissions reductions, we just can't count those twice. When it comes to prioritizing, is this a high priority mechanism? I actually think that's a different question, and you could say, well, yeah, it generates $20 million a year of revenue, which then will lead to these other programs actually happening. Maybe that's okay, and maybe committees should have like a veto power to say it doesn't fit the guidelines, but we really want this one to be a high impact. But it's really. I think there's a few different questions. If it's just in whether to prioritize it, that's one thing. But if it's counting, then it's either or. You either count TCI, the results of those programs as a result of TCI, or you count it as a result of those programs when you model it. You can't count it both ways. You can't stack them.
Yes, I agree. The way the program is designed right now, there'll be a very small price signal that'll result in some emissions reductions, but the primary mechanism is the investment of the proceeds. And I think as far as, and we can make assumptions about what those investments in those programs and what emissions reductions they will result in. But yeah, we don't want to count them twice. But I think it's also important to recognize that you can make estimates for what that effect will be. And then when emissions go down, they'll actually show up. I think there was a question about whether or not, these emissions can be estimated and or whether they will get quote unquote credit for them. It's like when they happen,
the proof will be in the pudding.
They'll appear in the inventory.
Yeah, exactly. The proof will be in the pudding when we see lower fossil fuel sales
Right.
numbers. I agree with you both, TJ and Brian, on this question, but I also think that we don't want to assume that the actions, the emissions reduction activities that would happen as a result of those investments would happen in the absence of that cap and those investments. So I'm not saying that you are suggesting that. I'm just saying I think that that's the flip side of this, is that while we want to avoid any potential kind of double counting between strategies or actions, we also shouldn't assume that a lot of this work would happen but for that cap sending a price signal in terms of the allowances, and but for the investment made possible on an annual basis to invest in emissions reducing, ideally equity advancing transportation measures. So I'm just saying that, yeah, I agree there's some nuance here. I just wanted to float the conversation so that we can, so I can bring back, others can bring back to the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee any suggestions for how that gets assessed. But I'm glad that overall this seems like a helpful contribution, and there's more resources that can also be brought to bear on this question from Brian and others. Okay.
Just what's the timing for that discussion? Is it happening, tomorrow at cross sector again, or is it some other time?
I don't know. We kind of left
tomorrow,
it. Sorry, go ahead.
well, we are talking about TCI tomorrow as one of the 5 actions that we're going to be working on in equity, the equity scoring rubric with cross-sector tomorrow, but we don't really have a time with cross-sector to revisit prioritization yet, and to really, Gina and Joey, as when they presented their actions last week, they didn't present them in the framework of prioritization as we had proposed for homework, and so it was a more open-ended conversation about priorities, and just trying to, there's clearly going to be discussion about TCI at the council and whether it's supported across the board by the council, and I imagine it will go to a vote. And so I think this question that Jared's posing and you all are discussing is sort of key to the argument of folks who are against it. And if there was a little more clarity around it, it might weaken that argument, perhaps.
Yeah, and I'm kind of not prejudging kind of where folks are on that argument or trying to, strengthen one side or the other of that argument. I'm just interested in the very specific data question of what's the appropriate and accurate way to assess the potential impact, since that has been put forward as a recommendation.
Yeah, and Jane, I think that Joey and Gene they're really looking for, like, what is it that they need to demonstrate? We're just trying to help them get through the evaluation of it in some way. So we have some tools and some approaches, and we think that they are helpful. Some are more straightforward than others. I'd have to say Jared's approach with some refinements to reflect how the program's actually designed is probably the easiest to understand.
And when you say that how the program's actually designed, Brian, do you mean the difference between the allowances being for fossil fuel sales versus like an emissions cap, that those fuel sales are related to an emissions profile, but it's not directly an emissions cap? It's more of a reduction in the carbon intensity of the fuels?
It's more about that. I just, if you talk about it in the future, don't say that the cap's equal to emissions in any particular year, because it's not.
Right.
The cap, we modeled a cap, and then we modeled emissions based upon that cap in a complicated regional model. And the 2023 cap is actually a little bit higher than forecast emissions. So that's why it declines at 30%. The actual emissions reductions is more like 26.
Right.
All right. And I don't want to bore everybody with this. It's like, it's nuanced. And that's why I'm saying your analysis, Jared, is the easiest to understand with a little bit of refinements. And then we can go into more detail on with either the investment tool and or the LEAP model to be able to reinforce that argument or something else. But I think the instructions that we're getting from the task group, that what they've asked for our help with is how do we do this evaluation with the methodology that's in the the prioritization memo. But and that's still, again, I still think those numbers, my understanding is those numbers are going to change, and or maybe the methodology is going to change. But I'm standing by for that.
Yeah.
I can talk about TCI for another 2 hours
Right.
if you guys
Yeah,
want.
please don't.
Thank you, Brian.
Sorry, Brian. Thank you.
Chance
just to
loves
get
it.
out of the weeds.
I will say one quick comment. I'll just say in general about communication around TCI, the TCI program is, I think you were probably on the email exchange, Brian, and maybe Jared, but Joey put together some really great material to sort of brief Secretary Young and Secretary Moore on TCI and sent it out Friday night. And as a newbie to this conversation myself, I read all those materials and just put a finer point back to them that they lack clear communication if you want to win somebody over on what TCI program is. It is not explainable to anybody who isn't inside already. And I put my actual specific questions back to Joey specifically about for a communication material up to the council, if you're considering a brief or something, these are the questions that it just raised so many more questions for me than it did actually give answers. So regardless, all these kind of intricate policies and ideas, they need to be communicable, and that those materials aren't yet. So hopefully we can help support that.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it seems to me that in prioritization, this TCI is something that the Climate Council needs to comment on and weigh in on. So just make it a priority, for the Climate Council to weigh in on. It's been around long enough and it has the revenue stream impacts. Maybe I'm speaking out of turn here, but I just think the council needs to take it up. This is part of the job, and it's not an easy question. And so getting into the details of whether it qualifies as a high priority action based on estimated emissions is just call the question. And whether that's the cross-sector mitigation committee needs to just call the question, or it's the full council. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, maybe
I
I'll
would
get in trouble
simplify
for saying
things,
that.
TJ, but that's like I said, I'm just supporting the task group leads.
Yeah, no, I hear you.
Well, and I do think that some people's decision about where they are on it will hopefully I'm not naive in thinking that evidence and data and kind of a rational presentation of its effectiveness or it matters.
Right.
I think that's what we're gonna get
My point is, though, I agree with you, but my point is that here's a policy that will raise $20 million of revenue, and that revenue will go to investments that create emissions reductions. And so that's a big deal. And then it also creates costs for Vermont consumers and businesses. And that's a big deal. And so we got to balance that. But I would say, so my reaction is yes, when you're looking at prioritization, say that this revenue leads to investments that lead to emissions, and those emissions levels, by the analysis you put up on the screen are high enough. That's not how I would count emissions, on a
right.
law.
That'll have to
but
show
that's a
up.
whole different question.
Yes.
And so, so that's my feedback, and then I come from that place
100%.
of the Climate Council needs to just address this. So.
And we need to address public comment because we are.
Yes, thank you. I apologize to folks that are hanging on, Mark and Matt and George. The conversation in the last hour was really fun, so I apologize. Thank you for hanging in there. So does anybody have any comments? Any comments from the public? George, you were first on the trigger button. You'd be good at Jeopardy.
For more
Really?
reasons than one.
What is the solution to global warming? The cat. Well, that's right. I should have. You can't do that, can you? Supposed to be. What is the cat? Oh, the answer is what is the solution to global warming? Oh well,
Yeah.
I would never make it there. I give it a good shot on categories. I'll take greenhouse gas emissions for 100. You guys are having entirely too much fun. Regards to your sensitivity analysis, in the chat I offered, and in follow-up to that chat, I have done some work on ISO New England emissions. And it turns out there's a pretty substantial amount of work embedded in that. And sorry about that. I got another meeting to go to shortly. There is a lot of complexity in the nuclear fuel cycle. I've done some work on that. I've done a lot of work on greenhouse gas emissions from gas-fired power plants and hydroelectric. Those could be provisional values in your sensitivity assessment if you have no numbers off the shelf of your own. Take it as you can. I can certainly, unfortunately, if I had the opportunity to bring it up earlier, the committee at large could have talked about it today. I wasn't aware this is likely to happen. They're obviously non-zero. The one that's most, I would say, controversial is hydroelectric for Hydro-Quebec. That one's got a lot of diverse values depending on which of the different academic studies you take. And we probably will continue that conversation because it's not an easy one to pull in. If it's simply a sensitivity study, it seems likely you should err on the high end and take a higher number, which is what my PDF that I'll be emailing will include. There's like 4 or 5 different studies ranging from a low of 36 kilograms per megawatt hour up to 300 or 400 kilograms per megawatt hour, depending on which academic studies you refer to and interpret. So I'll leave it to your group to decide which ones have value. If you're interested in additional follow-up, I can certainly work with you on that. That should be it for now. Thank you.
Thanks, George. And please do, when you email also, if you haven't already put that study in the public comment, and I know you've sent a lot of material. I haven't looked at all of it yet. But if you haven't already put it in the public comment portal, please do as well. So it's in that record.
No
Matt,
problem.
welcome. Oh, thanks, George. Matt, welcome.
Hi, thanks for the chance to talk. As someone that's hired to be able to come to as many of these public meetings as I can, I just wanted to shed some light on at least my impression. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but from the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee meeting last week, biomass got very intense of like whether those actions in general should be dropped just because of several subcommittee members' fierce opposition to it, to the point that they were saying, oh, we should not recommend any more development of facilities and we should slowly phase out those. So it definitely just like seemed a sort of red flag of how you all viewed biomass like for heating and for electricity, and any statistics you may have on that as different from where they are operating from. So I hate to say it because I totally hear how there's not enough time and there's not enough time for more discussion, but that would just be something I would say should have maybe a little more discussion, just because if they move to like toss those out based off of some discussion that they have there, and then you all are essentially operating on the assumption, well, oh no, like this is a needed area for growth. I don't know. I just don't want that disagreement to just clash in a council meeting down the line. So maybe just reach out to them, figure out whether those statistics that they have versus what you have are the same guidelines. Yeah, thanks.
I'll just quickly, because I wrote that to TJ by accident. I thought I wrote it to everyone, but in the chat. But they are talking specifically about industrial biomass for electricity, and it's one of their high priority actions to run through the scoring rubric. And Judy Dow wrote a sort of a write-up of concerns and suggested approaches specific around biomass. And happy to share that if folks are interested. They're writing sort of case statements for different components of high priority actions in the ag and ecosystems work. David Mears wrote one to build a case for a net wetland gain policy over the last week, and Judy wrote one specific in changing the pathways around biomass electricity production to saying that no new industrial biomass electricity production and phasing out our current ones in Vermont.
Thanks for that. That's pretty interesting, Jane. And thanks, Matt, for highlighting what could be just, us talking past each other at a minimum, or just in opposition. One thing I just want to point out is that, I think what we're talking about is not necessarily any recommendation for or against biomass in this committee, at least cross sectors dealing with those policy recommendations, but more just making sure that the analysis is encompassing kind of a range of possible outcomes for biomass emissions.
Agreed.
Richard, did you have comment you wanted to add on that?
I think it's been taken care of. Wood for heat is different from biomass for electricity.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And then, George, was your hand new related to that last discussion, or old hand?
Or did you ring in for a new category?
Yeah.
No, that's where it is. It was left out by accident.
Okay, cool. Thanks. All right. Well, thank you all. This was a really good discussion today. I think we covered a whole lot of ground. Thanks for sticking on till 22 after 4, but really, really good discussion. And I think we'll probably have some topics for next week as well, as follow-ons to today. So thank you again. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon.
Everybody.
See you later.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.